Well, my father was born in Vesta Heights, Pennsylvania, from parents who came over through Ellis Island from Czechoslovakia and Poland. He lived there until 1923. When he was 7 years old, they moved to Chicago on the northwest side of Chicago. An interesting fact is he did not know English until he went to grade school here in Chicago. So I think that shows part of his determination, which will come to use later on. He graduated from Burridge School, grade school, Carl Schurz High School, and was graduate of the first graduation class of what was then known as Wright College, Wright Junior College when I attended, and now I think it has a new name as well. That will take him up to 1938, and then we begin part of his story in the Air Force.
Now, why did your father enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and why the Air Corps?
That's a very interesting question, and I've thought about this a lot. I think there are two intersecting reasons why he joined the Air Force. One was because he had just gone through the Depression. His family had 6 children. He was very determined to help his mother. So joining the Air Force would give him 3 square meals a day, and he could send money home to his mother. And I think also that people knew that the war was out there on the horizon, so he wanted to be prepared for that. But I think the passionate reason that my father joined the Air Force was he was 11 years old when Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, and that just really fascinated him, the whole idea of flight and piloting, and he wanted to join the Air Force so he would have a chance to become a pilot himself. Unfortunately, he washed out of pilot training, but he did become a navigator, which I think, since he was a navigator, was the most important part on the plane, because he had to get those guys where they needed to go. So that's, I think, are the 2 reasons why he joined.
How did your father train for the Doolittle raid?
Well, when he enlisted in November of 1939 at Chanute Field in Illinois, he first trained as a radio person. I may need to redo this part later on, but he...
We'll just start it over again right now.
Well, let me take a look at my notes. Okay.
Just gonna move you up a little bit, Will.
All right, I'm ready to roll. Do you want to ask your question again, or I should just
I will ask the question
All
again.
right.
How did your father prepare for the Doolittle Tokyo raid?
Well, while I was researching this whole history of my father and the raid, I found out that it wasn't until 1939 that the Army Air Force really recognized the need for navigators as special people on the plane. And most of those navigators came from the pilots, washed out pilots, who needed to direct their attention elsewhere. And you needed good mathematical skills to become a navigator, and I think my father fit the bill in those regards. He enlisted in radio school at Chanute Field and graduated from navigator training in 1939 and took extra training in navigation at Barksdale, Louisiana, and he was commissioned in 1941 as a navigator at Chanute Field.
Rather than asking you specific questions about the raid, I'm just going to ask you to tell the story as you know it of your father's participation in the Tokyo raid.
Okay, I'm not sure why or how my father got to be part of Bob Gray's crew and plane number 3, called the Whiskey Pete, named after Bob's pony back in Texas. But luckily, he was one of those who was chosen to participate in what was then known as Special Project Number 1. He was up in Oregon at the time. The crews volunteered, and they came down to Eglin Field in Illinois, in Florida, to train. There was also a lot of extra training being done once they got on the Hornet, and that's the part where I would like to read to you from my notes because it's a very important part of the information.
Sure, go right ahead.
All right, here we go. Um, When I was I'm working on a project for the children of the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders, the story of the raid seen through the eyes of the navigators. So I did a lot of research down in Dallas at that library that holds the Doolittle papers, and I found out what Charles McClure had to say. He was the navigator on plane number 7, Ted Lawson's plane that crash landed on the coast of China. But this is what he says. Training for all crew members was continued on the carrier with lectures and practice. Every outline of the coast which we were to approach was carefully studied and memorized, Navigator McClure wrote. We went over and over and over again the exact route the ship should take, he recalled, what they should see, the points that would identify the targets, what the pilot, navigator, and bombardier would see as they approached the target, and when the pilot needed to pull up to the proper altitude for the run. They were also trained on the Hornet by Mission Adjunct Major Harry Johnson, who says, pilots plotted and replotted courses with their navigators until I felt most of them could have almost discarded their maps, which is part of an interesting story about my dad, whose maps blew overboard, but we'll get to that later. On the Hornet, training consisted of lectures on gunnery, navigation, and meteorology by members of our raiders and officers from the Hornet. Doolittle himself lectured on targets and gunnery practices. And Captain Akers, the Hornet's navigator, would take the navigators out to the deck, and the navigators would plot their courses and practice taking readings from the sun. So they really, I think any of the navigators could have flown there without their maps, but it happened that my father did without his maps.
Tell me the story about your father's maps. What happened and how did it happen?
Okay, when the sound, the announcement came over the loudspeaker, Army pilots man your planes. My dad was down at the, sitting down to breakfast, which he never got to eat. So I think the Navy still owes my dad a breakfast. But he ran to his cabin space and was packing up his suitcases and thing. And the Navy personnel, which were much in admiration of these flyers who were on their carrier about to take off for Japan, one of them decided that he would help my father. And my father, of course, said, sure, I need help. But by the time they got up to the deck where the planes were, the poor Navy personnel had to come to my father and tell him that all his maps were blown overboard, and he felt very bad about that. I think my father might have felt very bad about that too, but because of his attitude and because of who he was, I'm sure when he got on that plane, he knew where he was going, and it wasn't as big of a loss to him as it was to that poor Navy personnel guy. But I think this says a lot about my father. As kids, we would ask him, who was that? What's his name? What did you do to him? Did you report him? And my father said, no, he would never reveal that man's name. So, I think that speaks to the camaraderie between the different branches of the service, and also speaks to my father, who would recognize the mistake, but not hold it against the person.
Now, can you talk a little bit about during the mission itself, what he did, how he did it?
I may need to look at my notes for a moment. So
Okay.
please, let's do that. Oh, I already talked about it. Okay. Well, we talked about he was on the plane with no maps, but he did know how to take, what's the word? Oh, okay.
Sensitive readings.
Oh, one sec.
Sorry about that.
The problem with these kind of chairs.
Yeah.
That's okay. We'll come back to that later.
This question we're coming back to later?
Yeah.
Sounds
So-
like a plan.
They fly to Tokyo and they're successful.
They are.
They survive. They're on their way to China.
Hmm.
What happens next?
Well, we know that they took off the carry early because they were spotted by a Japanese picket boat. So everybody was worried about how much fuel they were going to have. But my father's plane got to Tokyo. The bombardier lined up the plane. They hit gas and oil refineries. They came off of flying to China, and with the help of the man above, they got a tailwind. So they had enough gas to get to China. My father talks about good weather until they got to the Chinese coast, and then it was very rainy, and the ceiling dropped, and they were having real difficulty spotting, let alone cities, but the airports that they were supposed to land at. But for reasons that we won't go into here, those airports were never actually notified that the raiders were coming, let alone early. So when they had about 15 minutes of fuel left, the pilot, Bob Gray, sent the plane on automatic and told the guys to jump out of the plane. And they did. My father describes it as jumping into that dark, rainy night. And little did he know what was just about to happen to him. Do you want me to go on about
Yeah,
the
what
actual?
did happen?
Okay. Unfortunately, the gunners shooting it open, and he did not survive the parachute jump. But my father landed, his chute caught on the side of a mountain, and it was dark and rainy, and so my father just hung there through the night. It was probably around midnight, so he hung there for around 8 hours. And then when he woke up, he thought that he was up in heaven with St. Peter, because all he could see was fog down below him, and he was up in the mountains and didn't know where else he could be except with St. Peter. But then he recognized that he was caught on the cliff, so he took his chute cords and pulled himself up. But of course, that took a lot of energy, and he did have a very serious wound in his leg, which my father did not know at the time until he got himself up over on the cliff, so he passed out for maybe a half of a day. Then when he woke up, he saw that his leg had such a serious injury, so he wrapped his navigator scarf around his leg and was crawling away on his hands and knees when he was found by some Chinese who had first time seen an American and said, "What's this?" And so they ran down to the village and told the village leader that there was a man up in the mountains that needed help. And the story continues. My dad was carried down the mountain to the village leader's house, Mr. Liao, and then stayed there for 5 days and was treated very kindly, very graciously, and recuperated. And I experienced the same difficulty with the Chinese language. I could just imagine my father. They were taught a saying about how to say, "I am an American," but no, dialects are very numerous in China, and no one understood what he was saying. But through pantomime and other ways, they got to know what they needed, and the Chinese were so kind to give my father the space and the comfort that he needed. Took care of him, washed his clothes, bandaged his wounds, fed him things he had never seen before, but he ate them. And he liked to sit out in the courtyard in the afternoon, sunning himself. And that continued throughout his life. You'd find him at the beach, sitting in the sun. He loved the sun. So that's it.
There's a story about a penny.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell me that story?
Oh, I'd be happy to. I have a picture of me holding that very same penny. Because the Chinese treated the raiders so kindly, because the raiders wanted to give back to the Chinese, they would give them bullets or buttons off of their uniforms. My father, who I always wonder about this story. Why didn't he give him more than a penny? But a penny was probably all that was left in his pocket after he jumped out of an airplane. My father gave that family a 1937 American penny as a souvenir. And that penny plays into later on in the story, back in 2010, 2009 really, my father reconnected with this family. And we knew it was the family that took care of my father because that penny was sent.
I'm sorry, we're picking up a background beep.
Yeah, I think it was the washer or dryer just went off.
Oh,
Sounds like it's.
what do you need me to tell?
We would just like you to re-answer that question. I'm sorry about that.
Telling the story of the 1937 American penny that this Chinese family had. The Americans were so anxious to thank their rescuers, thanks to people who they met while they were in China, that they gave them buttons off their uniforms, gave them probably money, bullets, anything that would represent that they had been part of a raider's life. So my father, all he had left in his pocket was an American 1937 penny. So he gave it to the Liao family, who still has it this day. I got to hold that penny in my hand in 2018 when I went back to China. And the interesting thing about that penny is it reconnected my father with that family. Because in 2009, my dad got a letter from a family in China saying that they were trying to know what happened to this raider that they helped. Was he still alive? Did he remember? And they sent him pictures of the penny. They sent him pictures of the son, the oldest son, who now holds on to that penny. And they sent him pictures of the bamboo chairs that they carried him in and things like that. So my father reconnected, and I got to go to China and meet this family in person. So a penny is worth more than a penny.
Tell me a little bit about your father's post-raid military service.
I may need to refer to some papers on this, but I will see what I can tell you. Oh, thank you very much. After the raid, and my father got back to the States through India, Tom Griffith and my father, Charles, were sent on a bond tour, which I have pictures of. And after they finished their bond tour in late 1940, they were also awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in Washington. We don't want to forget about that. But after they finished their bond tour, he joined, we will read. He joined the 441st Bomb Squadron of the 320th Bomb Group in Lakeland, Florida, and trained to be a navigator on the B-26. So he went overseas, went back to North Africa. He was involved in 2 serious plane crashes, which hurt his back, so he spent some amount of time in the hospital. And after his second plane crash, they decided that it would be better for him to go back to the United States and become a navigator trainer of B-26s. So that's where he ended the war for about the last year. He was training other navigators on B-26s, and then he was discharged from the Army Air Force in 1945.
So when your father returned to civilian life,
Yeah.
what did he do?
Well, his father was a machinist, so he worked part-time in his dad's machine shop, and the other full-time job he had was at Motorola, who used to build televisions and things before they got into the phone business and whatever else they're involved in now. But he was probably the last generation that stayed at one job for his whole life. So he worked at Motorola for 35 years and retired in 1980. My parents then moved to Libertyville, Illinois, and to a smaller home because most of the kids were gone, except for this kid. And then in 1988, they moved down to San Antonio, Texas, to an Air Force retirement home. During this time, after the service, he also had 6 children. He met and married my mother in 1948. He had 6 children from 1949 to 1955, but he had twins in there, so it wasn't, my mother was not pregnant for 7 years. And I was very happy to know that when he retired down to Texas, that he had a good 20 years of just being alone with my mother and just, having a life together with her again. Because when they married, they started having babies.
Growing up, how much or how little did you know about your father's heroism?
Very interesting question. Very little. My father had his army trunk up in the attic, and when he wasn't around, we would all take turns going through all this memorabilia, and we knew that he had done something important. And when I was in grade school, 1957 to 1964, he led us on the anniversary of the raid. He had a big green binder that I guess was given out at one of the reunions, and it had pictures of all the planes and everything about the raid. He would let us take that to school, and the nuns were very impressed about who we were related to. But he would never, Wally Phillips, who was an important disc jockey here in Chicago, who would be searching out raiders to talk to on the anniversary. My father was never at home when Wally Phillips called them, because he just didn't talk about the raid. He didn't talk about his service. He was very soft-spoken, as many of those guys were who came back from the war and didn't, wanted to dwell. They were more looking towards the future of what was going to be for them out in the future. So I probably read 30 Seconds Over Tokyo around that same time too. And every time I would find a quote about my father, I would be just excited that my father had said something that I didn't know about. But I really didn't know much about the raid until I got connected with the Children of the Doolittle Raiders.
Did he go to any of the reunions? Did you?
Exciting. Yes, he did go to one in 1950 that was held in Palm Springs, California. I have a picture. I myself went to 3 of them. And when the raider dies, the city of Tucson, Arizona, I think it was in 1955, gave the raiders silver goblets that had their name engraved on both sides. So when someone died, they would turn their cup upside down, but the writing of the name would be right side up. So in 2000, my dad died in October of 2010. So in April of 2011, the reunion in Omaha, Nebraska was where they were going to turn my father's goblet over. So of course I wanted to be there for that. It was a very moving experience with raiders who were still alive, calling the roll call, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to that one. I also went to the 2013 reunion in Florida, which was supposedly the final tour, but then final tours get to be final tours. And I went to the one in 2015 in Washington where they were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, which was then turned over to the Air Force Museum in Ohio. I was just in the Washington part. I didn't carry on. But I have an important artifact that I want to share with you about that Congressional Medal.
Tell me.
Well, after the awarding of the medal, they also awarded a big parchment sheet that said this recognizes that Charles Ozuk received the Congressional Medal of Honor and a large medal of the award, which are now down in the safekeeping of my twin sister in San Antonio, Texas. But they also sent me, because I was there, a goblet glass that talks about the award and a small medal that talks about the award. So I have those artifacts there for you.
When and why did you decide it was important to go to China?
Well, it's an interesting story, as they all are. I talked about my father getting the letter from the family in China in 2009, and then through the correspondence, recognizing that it was my father that they had taken care of. My father died in October of 2010, so I was then carrying on conversation with the family, who were then moving out of the house where my father stayed in the mountains, and were moving what they called down in the plains. And they invited me to come and see them, and I thought, that's a pretty big country over there to find this family on the plains. So I bided my time until the children of the Doolittle Raiders announced that they were going to go and follow in the footsteps of our fathers in China. And lo and behold, I knew that we were going to go see the house where my father stayed, and I was overjoyed about that fact. But little did I know what was awaiting me when I got over to China. So that's why I decided to go back to China. And, you know, who wouldn't want to see China?
So what did you hope to find?
Well,
By travel?
okay. The idea of home has always been a very important part in my own search of coming home, being at home, welcoming people into my home. So I wanted to see that house that played such an important part in my father's life, that home that took care of him. Because all this happened before he met my mother in 1948 and got married. So, you know, if that home had not welcomed and had taken care of my father, I might not even be here, you know? So I wanted to go there to say a thank you from my family to those people. And when I left China in 2018, I announced that I came over with 4 nationalities, Polish, Czechoslovakian, French, and Irish, but I was going home with 5 because I added China to one of my nationalities, Chinese, I should say. So that's, I mean, because of the connection to my dad, I found it very important.
While you were in China, who did you meet?
Now, clarification on this question, Bill. Do you want me to talk about the family, or do you want me to talk about all the other, we were feted
Talk
and
about the family.
we were going all over the place. All right, I met the son of the man who had saved my father, the eldest son. Everything goes to the eldest son over in China. I met his brothers, his children, and a lot of people following us around. I was a big celebrity when I was in China. I have something to show you on that too. So I found it we're very close in age, naturally, the eldest son of his father, and me as the second eldest of my father. So I think that was the most important thing about meeting that family and recognizing that we really are a family of brothers and sisters throughout the world. This is not just you're Chinese, so you're over there, but feeling that real connection between that family and my family.
There's a picture of you, and you're at a museum.
Yes, I have that artifact.
Talk about where you
Okay.
were and what that experience was like.
When we were over in China, we went to many museums that were set up for the Doolittle Raiders. In fact, you know, when I left on that trip to China, I was sitting at O'Hare Airport, taking you back, and waiting to get on the plane, and was talking to other people who were traveling to China too, asking them why they were going there. And they were going there just to tour and go around or go through China to someplace else. And I asked them if they knew about the Doolittle Tokyo Raid, and nobody knows anything about the Doolittle Tokyo Raid. And they were my age, which, you know, so when I explained them about the raid, I thought, well, I'm passing on history here. So that picture of me at the museum was taken, I think it was in Bayonne. My Chinese is not good, but we'll get the spelling out for you. We visited a museum that was set up for the Doolittle Raiders. I think, in fact, it was just completed shortly before we got there. Jeff Thatcher, the head of the Children of the Doolittle Raiders, was part of the opening of that museum. And so, you know, as I'm looking around through their artifacts, I spy this picture of the Raiders getting the Distinguished Flying Cross. And I always knew about that picture, but I don't think I had seen it before. So I was kneeling on the floor, counting little heads, and I could spot my father a mile away, but I wanted to see if he was in that picture, and he was. And so the many photographers were following me around, somebody took a picture which ended up on the front page of the China Daily a couple of days later. China Daily is the English-speaking newspaper in China. So little did I know. When I'm walking around China, I'm not, I didn't know I had a whole retinue of people behind me, but I did. So I was grateful for that, because I am now the proud owner of a copy of that newspaper. And that I spotted my dad.
How do you think your father's experience in China shaped him as a person?
When I read that question, I was thinking, now, how am I supposed to know the answer to this? When I thought about it, I think I've already spoken about some of the things. His sense of responsibility, which certainly, he had all these things before he joined, because he was the eldest son, firstborn of his family, and he had to help raise his 5 brothers and sisters. So I think he took that sense of responsibility, very important. Certainly passed that on to us as his children, that we needed to be responsible. I think another thing that shaped him in that was the need to be prepared. With all that training that he got to be on the raid, the maps were, it wasn't a big deal that he didn't have his maps. He had his maps in his head, and he was always the navigator for our family when we would go on vacations. But we had a map with us when we did that. He taught us, or he taught me at least, how to read a map and know how far we were and where we were going, where to turn right and left. I think also that my brother speaks, when my dad died and my brother and I did eulogies for my dad, my brother called him the North Star, which I felt was very poignant, because he certainly was on the raid, taking his sightings from the sun and the stars, that he knew how to get that plane where they were going. And his very sense of confidence, because while they were flying from the carrier, from Japan to China, they saw another B-25 out in the sky, and my dad's pilot asked him, he said, "One of you 2 navigators is correct. Which one are you?" And my dad confidently replied, "It's me." If it was me, I'd say, let's go with that other guy. At least there'd be 2 of us together. But my father was that strong in his, very assured in what he knew. And, when I doubt and I think about what am I going to say, what do I need with me, I realize that most of us have inside of us what we need. We just have to be confident in ourselves to know that we have that with us, what we need. So I think those are some of the graces that my dad gave us. And he certainly was very hardworking. And I think that came out of the raid, too, that you had to be confident and prepared and assured, and it would work out. In fact, whenever I wanted to, try something new, my father would always say, try it out. Go ahead, see what's going to happen. My mother, on the other hand, would say, oh, my goodness. So my father gave me the confidence that, when I wanted to try something new, that was the way to go.
Susan?
Yes.
Try not to lean back and forth so much. Get comfortable, but.
All right, sorry about that. I'll stay put.
Okay, that's all for my questions. Is there something else that you want to add?
Let me see. Oh, one of your questions that you gave me was, what was the most memorable thing that happened to me?
Yes, go ahead.
There were
please.
2 things that were most memorable to me. One of them was being at the house, sitting on the same bed that my father sat on, meeting the family, recognizing that I had another family in China. The second most memorable thing was when we met with the archivist before we got to the house of the Jiangshan province. I will give you a spelling on that. And he gave a report on what he found about the raid and the digs that they had to dig up pieces of the plane or artifacts from the plane. I have a copy of the bill that proves that they paid the porters who carried my father down the mountainside. So I think those 2 experiences were the most memorable to me. But getting to any other questions, I have
No,
three
now
questions.
what I'd like, well, I'm okay. Do they need to feed the meters?
Oh, yeah.
Guys?
I am okay.
I'm okay.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.
What I want to do then is I want to go to that 1957
Oh.
document.
You don't want me to tell you what other questions you didn't ask?
Tell me the questions I didn't ask.
Well, we talked about the Band of Brothers, we talked about the Raiders, we talked about the landings in China, but we have not talked about the B-25, which was the plane that actually got them there, and how the dynamics of this plane, which I will leave you to ask if you interview any children of pilots on the plane. But I think the B-25 has a great story of its own and a great impact on this whole, and why it was chosen and things like that.
Actually, I'm going to have James Scott talk about that.
Okay, well, make sure you ask him about that. Another thing that I would like to do is help restore that house where my father was stayed for 5 days and recuperated. In fact, most of the other houses in that area were torn down, but the Chinese government said we can't tear this one down because it has historical significance. That's another thing I probably alluded to but didn't really talk much about, but how important this raid is for the average Chinese person. You know, I talked about the people at O'Hare Airport who didn't know anything about it, but I think if you ask anybody in China about the Doolittle raid, they would know certainly what that did for China, and China suffered greatly because of the little pieces that the raiders handed out to other people when the Japanese were searching for the crews and couldn't find them, except for 2, unfortunately. So the Chinese people are owed a great debt of gratitude, not just from the families of the raiders, but from the United States too, for what they did in the war. And in fact, they had been in the war for a couple of years even before the raid came along. So my plan is to help restore that house. I did have, when I was over there, I said, I'm going to make this into a bed and breakfast, and I'll be over here. But, you know, I'd have to put in pipes and all that kind of things, too, and lay sewer lines. So I just want to help restore that house to make it, not a shrine, but to make it a place where the Chinese people can come and visit and see their part in this story. And the third thing was that whole story about Happy Landings. That my father would always sign his pictures Happy Landings. And so through the Chinese people, my dad had a happy landing, and I'm having a happy landing today. So thank you.